Welcome back into the B-Sides of Sports. This is, again, as we heat up our NBA coverage and as it's about to become the norm, we just thought we'd do one. Obviously, a lot of big news happening in the NBA right now, but before we get into that, just once again, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe if you're enjoying the content, as well as check out our TikTok. The link to that will be down below, as well as the link to our Spotify for audio-only versions of this, as well as our whole Season 3 playlist if you're curious about any of that. And so going into the NBA, I think the biggest news as of recent, I mean, there's a lot you can make the argument for, but I think a lot of it revolves around the All-Star roster, as well as the award ceremony. Obviously a big year with the last year of the captain's format of the All-Star game. And we also have the new 65 game minimum rule. So as we go into that, that's kind of what we're going to discuss here over the next 10 or 20 minutes or so. But for starters, we are going to start with the All-Star starters being announced. The names are as follows. In the West, the front court is LeBron, KD, and Jokic, and then SGA and Luka round out the backcourt. And then on the East, we have Lillard and Halliburton in the front court with Antetokounmpo, Embiid, and Tatum in the front court. Wilson, how do you feel about these guys being the starters?
Yeah, I don't think the West in particular was too controversial at all. I think just LeBron is one of those guys where at this point in his career, he's going to be grandfathered in, right? He always runs away with the fan vote to an extent, and he's just so well regarded by the media and by coaches. I think LeBron, as long as he's playing at kind of this top caliber level, is always going to get grandfathered into that spot. And in terms of the backcourt, I heard a lot of people calling for Curry to get a spot there. I just don't think the numbers would have backed that at all, as well as just the team play. Both the Mavs and particularly the Thunder have been playing much better as an overall roster, so I think you had to give the nods to SGA and Luka. And then in the East, Halliburton, Antetokounmpo, Embiid, and Tatum, I think those have to be four of the guys. The only one I would question is the Lillard, and I think, Maxey had an argument for it, and even more than Maxey, I think Jalen Brunson had an argument. And in a particular, the thing that I really think is just important to highlight is I don't think you should have two starters in the All-Star game off of the same roster unless that team is running away with the number one seed. And the Milwaukee Bucks have not been that, right? We've seen them have a little bit of controversy and a little bit of disarray as of recent. So I just think even the numbers alone, Brunson, I think, has been a better point guard this year than Lillard. So I would have put Brunson in, but otherwise didn't think anything was too crazy with these starters.
That's, again, my biggest takeaway is just Brunson, because I think they nailed it, honestly. And usually I think there's a lot more of an argument. Now, reserves is where I think it's going to get chippy, because I feel like there are quite a few players who are kind of either fringe, where they probably earn the right to be grandfathered in, with a combination of players who are just playing out of their mind. I think there's going to be quite a few of those. And one in particular, my guy Scotty Barnes for the Raptors. He's kind of what I think going to be a fringe guy, because as he's transitioning into the number one option on our team, not really sure if he's going to have enough to make the reserves. But just to go back to starters, I really think they knocked it out of the park. Like you said with Steph, that really, in my opinion, is the only one that really has any credence in being debated. And that's because of, again, it's what do you take more precedent of, being grandfathered in or being two of the best players in the West on competitive teams. The Warriors aren't very competitive right now. So I understand the rationale. So again, as much as I'm not big on SGA, and I think Luka, is, again, if such an insanely high usage player, I think there's an argument still for Steph to be in. So I do want to make sure that. And as a guy who's not particularly a Warriors fan, I just think that speaks again to the president of what Steph Curry is to the league as well as to his team. So him and Brunson, in my opinion, and Maxey also I'm really glad Halliburton got the start. I was really nervous about that, but what he's been able to do for Indiana is he's making Indiana a TNT caliber team. I mean, I have not seen Indiana have this many primetime games in God knows how long, and that's just pretty much because of him. So really just so glad they got that right, because, man, he has just been phenomenal this year, and I thought the injury might have derailed that a little bit, but I'm just really glad he got the nod.
Yeah, I think really fair points. And I think it's a little difficult to kind of project kind of the controversies around the reserves without knowing who they're actually going to be. I do agree. I'd really like to see Scotty Barnes make it in. I wonder, and I could be just completely off on this, but I wonder if a point of contention once they start announcing them is going to be Banchero versus Barnes, because their numbers are very similar. I think Scotty's around 28 and 6, Banchero somewhere in the 20 23, 7, and 5 range. And I think just the Magic being better, I think it just becomes the perennial question of whether or not we want to value winning as an overall team, or if we want to value kind of the overall impact to the game, even though the numbers are similar. I think the way that kind of just the control of that offense that Scotty has is a little greater than what Banchero is able to do. Banchero has a little bit of a better supporting cast around him. So I think those conversations are a little bit easier to have once we actually know who the reserves are going to be. So I'll reserve most of my kind of dialogue around that until we actually know what those lineups are going to be.
For sure. And so I just think with that, as we look over, and we go on to the reserves, who are some players, that you are really confident in making, and who are kind of some that you are fringe players that you would really like to see get in?
Yeah, I'll start with some fringe players, and this is where it gets a little interesting. Derek White is a guy that's been brought up a lot this year on whether or not he should be considered, high enough of a caliber of player to make it in. And I think when you look at the history of NBA All-Stars, it's similar to kind of the Pro Bowl for the NFL, right? Where depending on the number of injuries in a given year and just kind of the up and down fluctuations at different positions, sometimes guys that when you look at the career at the end of it, you might not think are an all-star or Pro Bowl caliber player make it in some kind of strange years. And I think Derek White could be one of those guys this year that gets in on the fringe. I wonder if it becomes a matter of, obviously Boston has been what seems like the far and away best team of the league this year, obviously 37-11, that gaudy record has them leading the entire NBA. I think, if Drew Holiday is still an all-star caliber player, because you figure that Brown is going to get in with the reserves. So I think that'll be an interesting conversation on whether or not they're deserving of having 4 all-stars, or if White makes it in over Drew Holiday, things like that. In terms of names that you expect to get in, I just think there's such a long list of superstars now across the league, where the conversation around grandfathering in versus young talent is going to get real interesting. And I think it's why these pools are going to be extra big, just in the Western Conference, right? The Timberwolves are a team who, they probably have 2 or 3 all-star caliber players, right? Gobert, Cat, and Edwards are all, playing really, really well this year. The Nuggets, obviously, Murray should be on that list. The Thunder, borderline Jalen Williams. I don't think Holmgren's quite there yet, but then, the Clippers are the number 4 team in the West right now and not a single starter, right? But, you've got an amazing season out of Harden so far. We know that PG and Kawhi are still some of the best two-way players in the league. I just think it starts to get real tight. Not, we haven't even mentioned players off the Kings. Obviously, KD got in for the Suns, but the Pelicans have guys too, right? I just think we're at the point where the list of names is going to be so long. I hate to cop out again, but I'm just really curious to see who gets snubbed, because I'm curious to kind of craft the arguments of who should have gotten in over who.
Yeah, so this is kind of a curveball. This isn't in our script, so I'm going off script here for a sec, but as I was making my list and going over who I think should make it, I think the NBA has almost promoted the league too well in terms of there are now so many superstars, as you said, because this is a players league. The NBA is not really a team league, in my opinion. It's what I said. It's so hard to follow a team in the NBA compared to following players. It's why, as a fan, I have the Raptors, but more than anything, I really do follow individuals. So I think there's an argument for extending the ballot for the game, just because we have 3 all NBA teams and an all rookie team. So to say that we shouldn't have more roster spots, to me, I just think is a little silly. I really am in the camp of, I think maybe adding 2 roster spots on each team could go dividends, because the All-Star game is supposed to be about showcasing premier talent. The NBA, though, has so much premier talent nowadays. It's so hard to showcase it all in one weekend. So I don't know how you feel about this. That's kind of what I'm opening up to you. What do you think about the capacity of, again, the NBA has marketed itself so well, maybe too well, that now there are so many people who fans want in, and there's just not the capacity for it. So where do you kind of sit on that?
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Drake called it a script. We usually call it a rundown. I promise we're not reading off of predetermined lines here. But I think that's really interesting. I think there's a lot of merit in that, right? I think the All-Star game, usually it's 12 and 12, 24 players in total. I think there's a really, really solid argument to go to 30, 15 on each side, given that a traditional NBA roster is 15 players. And I think more so than that, one of the kind of hidden benefits of your proposal there is, while getting to kind of, again, grandfather some of the older players in the league that we kind of want to show respect to, and kind of the historical relevancy of telling the story of who's an all-star. Given the opportunity for some of these young guns to get in there and honestly play more, right? We've seen over the last couple of years, guys like LeBron really don't have any type of investment in wanting to actually play in the all-star game. And, while the league is trying to combat that, I think at the end of the day, players are going to prioritize their health over anything else. And as a result, a lot of the older guys, they're not going to try that hard. But I do wonder if you get, say, 4 or 6 of these younger guys into the All-Star game, if it kind of changes the dynamic of the game itself, and whether or not we'd actually just see some better basketball being played the day of the game. People might argue, I guess the counter would be that there's only been 24 in the past. So all of a sudden you're kind of opening the lanes for more. I guess like you're diminishing the value of an all-star is what one of the counters would be, but I don't really agree with that. I think you're right. The talent is at an all-time high in the league, particularly on the skill, right? It's not even like we're having better athletes than before. We just, all of these guys can pass, dribble, shoot, right? And I think just highlighting that would do wonders for the league, and we could get a better game as a result.
Well, and here's what I want to say. I hate the mentality of the Hall of Fame being inflated, or that there are now so many players in who don't deserve it. The Hall of Fame is a made up thing in a made up sport. Okay. We put the parameters for this. You know what those guys get by getting into the Hall of Fame? They get pensions. They get health insurance for their whole life. They get benefits that these guys who've entertained us our whole lives deserve. In all honesty, I'm of the capacity that I think anyone who's remotely good should be in the Hall of Fame, because not only did you make it to the NFL, playing in the NFL for more than 10 years, to me, if you made it in the league for more than 10 years, you're borderline a Hall of Famer in my head, because that means the average NFL career is 3 years. You tripled that. Even if you were a backup, you somehow stayed on a roster for that long. My same argument goes for the NBA with the same people. It's baseball fans. It's the baseball mentality. They let like one person in the Hall of Fame each year. The home run leader isn't in the Hall of Fame. The hits leader isn't in the Hall of Fame. That is no fun. I don't care. I think it's stupid that these imaginary buildings that we make, we think are oversaturated, and nothing pisses me off more. Deion Sanders said it a few years back, and I've been outspoken about how I'm not a big fan of him, but he said it's just the Hall of Very Good now. Who cares? It's a fake thing that we all made up. All getting in the Hall of Fame does is you get a head trophy and you get better benefits. Do the guys not deserve that? By complaining, it just seems so entitled to me, and it's just ridiculous. And so I am 100% in favor of adding roster spots, and maybe even for the NBA, those roster spots, maybe add 2 roster spots that have to be players on their first contract or something to really highlight the young. We have the Rising Stars game. Maybe give the best of those an opportunity to play in the bigger game, right? To maybe not grandfather them in, but, give them an opportunity that they usually wouldn't have, give some, fun dynamic players in there. There's guys like Anthony Simmons, right? Who's a fantastic player, probably won't make the All-Star game, but he's super young and he's trying to lead a young team to relevancy. I think there's quite a bit of pride in that, and I think, in some years he could get a nod. Or again, you brought up a guy like James Harden, he's instrumental to them winning, but his stats aren't necessarily there. None of those players are on that Clippers team. So are we going to give them, almost exclude them for that? I just think that's stupid. So I proposed it, but I'm 100% in favor of adding more spots to the All-Star game.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really fair point, and a really good idea. And to your point about kind of, the historical relevancy and, wanting to kind of almost gatekeep to an extent, right? Entry into these, these, you're right, made up kind of figments of how we value players, right? I think one thing that's important to note is that eras are different, right? Eras evolve, and the talent in these leagues does get deeper. We talk about the NFL all the time right now. There are so many good wide receivers in the league. And when you go down the list of some of the top receivers that have ever played the game, who are probably not going to get into the Hall of Fame, right? The NFL only takes 5 players a year. And when you look at some of the retirees or potential retirees on the league, there is a number of guys who have had Hall of Fame careers that will not be considered Hall of Famers. And again, I think, you could say the same thing about the Constitution, right? Like it's alive and living, breathing thing, right? Like, why can't we do that for the Hall of Fame, right? Just because 80 years ago we agreed upon it can only be X number of players at a certain time. Again, things change. People get better at the sport. And I think, if you want to talk about the historical relevancy, I think it's important to highlight how skilled was the league, just how many good players were there in this era, right? There's not only 10 good players at a time, right? There's not an arbitrary number that we can just say. And right now, right, we kind of have it with the bigs. There's that conversation with the All NBA teams, right, with Jokic and Embiid, where basically, or I guess they did change it, right? Now,
Mhm.
you don't just have to be a center.
Yeah,
I'm okay
it's
with that because
mhm.
Embiid and Jokic are probably the two, if not, you can call them top
Yep.
three best front court players in the league. And for one of those guys to be off the ballot every year, I guess you could go back and maybe some people want to argue that Olajuwon and Robinson had to share those spots or something like that. But I just again, if they're the best of the best, they should be recognized as such.
Yeah, and again, I'm not really going to add too much, but the league changes. We hold these things so tried and true for no reason. Again, we're the reason these are stagnant, right? The voters are the reason. Old head mentality is it's like an epidemic in sports, especially in the social media area. I think old head mentality, talking about how these guys are soft and yada yada yada, like, and the Hall of Fame to me is just an extension that it is the physical manifestation of old head mentality. The Hall of Fame is, and so I just would love to see some growth there. But now, kind of getting back to what we were talking about before, and that again, just this All-Star weekend, but more of for this year. The new thing this year, the new shiny whistle, is sort of this 65 game requirement. Now, while as I was a fan of this initially, I am starting to have some issues with it as of late, as we're getting a little more into the year, and I think everyone is. I think we're all just kind of having our eyes open for, oh, okay, this is a little more complicated than we all thought, because for main awards, MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, Rookie of the Year, and those, you need the 65 games, as well as the All NBA teams, which All NBA teams are, again, huge signifier, especially with Hall of Fame president. So those are very important. And again, also for contract negotiations, you can get paid more money with All NBA selections due to the way the NBA salary works. So Wilson, I'm just going to kind of open this up to you, and we'll take where you want to. But this 65 game requirement, where do you want to start with it?
Yeah, I think the points you laid out is exactly where I stand on this right now. And while initially I really liked it, kind of this idea of wanting the players to play more, I think we're kind of seeing some of the hidden cons that have come about with this, right? Players that aren't healthy are trying to force themselves to play because there are huge monetary incentives tied to, getting those all NBA considerations. And, I heard a take earlier today that I agreed with, and it was talking about maybe we should consider it for the MVP because availability should be an incredibly valuable thing when considering most valuable player, but maybe we take away some of that with All NBA. And I understand it becomes a little bit difficult when you don't make it so black and white. But on the All NBA side of things, it's not even just the injuries. It's I think the context of playing sports is important to kind of consider and asking players to be able to play 80% of the games. And, I agree. If a player is healthy and if they're not that old, load management is something that we should probably diminish to an extent, right? It's important for the league to have its best players playing. But at the same time, one of the things that I've heard a lot over the last couple of weeks is, the NBA, the 65 game cutoff, is essentially 79% of games. So you're asking the players to be involved with 80% of the games in order to be considered for these awards. And what people want to say is, well, can you, like, if your job told you had to show up for four out of 5 days a week, is that absurd? And of course the answer is no. But what that fails to account for is, like, our job doesn't involve this risk of getting injured, right? Like, if you and I were to use the podcast as an example, if we were going to work on the podcast 5 days a week, well, the number of things that could majorly affect us to not be able to do the pod if it was full time are very small. Like, if you got sick, we would do it in a different capacity versus, if one of these guys, if you have a calf strain or something, that's something that, like, it really affects your ability to do the job. And it's also part of the job. Like, injuries are part of the game. And that's something that I think historically we've kind of had just the free will and the understanding of the context of whether or not a guy should be considered for award. When were they injured? How long were they out for? And I think when you assign a number to it, and again, it's something that I didn't see coming, but all of a sudden assigning a number to it, it is putting so much stress on these players. And I think we just saw it with Embiid. Ironically, you and I are both wearing a Philly jersey. I am wearing an Embiid jersey today. And, to me, it's frustrating to see that he, in my opinion, he forced himself to play in the game against the Warriors last night, partially because of the scrutiny around, whether or not he's ducking the matchup in Denver and all of those silly narratives. But also, he knows that he needs to play 65 games. And, we're just over the halfway point of the season. Realistically, he's not going to make it to the 65 game mark. And I just hate to see, a guy compromise himself because of this number that we've assigned to, how many games they need to play.
No, I think that's very well said. I don't have too much to add to that. I think you laid out the argument very well. I haven't really thought of the MVP thing. That really seems to be sitting right in front of me, but I think that's a great decision. I've also been a fan of going back to the 70 game schedule and spreading out games a little more. NBA doesn't really have, Thursday night football, Sunday, like they don't have the same sentiment because they play so many games. So I just think the COVID year went over so well, and it was such a, in my opinion, entertaining year of basketball. I know people have their things they'll say about it, but I loved the bubble. It was great. It was on when nothing else was. I think they managed it very well, but yeah, I think it's just kind of hard because, and then also play style is something that factors in. A guy like LeBron historically has taken a beating and not gotten penalties, meaning teams understand that and they're going to hit him more. Now, I think, again, LeBron, he's one of the players every year he should be in the MVP conversation, but that 65 game number is going to be hard for him. Or a guy like Embiid, just go to your case. That's a guy whose play style is very physical. He's posting up every single play, right? So I think it just doesn't favor certain players who are deserving of those awards. And I think that's why it's tricky to me, because I think what you laid out is the main point. That's my main takeaway. But I also just think play style can kind of be damned for that 65 game thing, because depending on your play style, if you're a more physical player, that doesn't favor you. And I know Giannis has been healthy so far in his career, but at some point with how physical he plays, injuries are going to start happening. And so again, in 5 years, he might not be eligible for all NBA, despite being, again, arguably the best basketball player on the court when everyone's on it. Right. So I just think it's interesting. And yeah, I'm really curious to see, because I know this is something they amended so it can be fixed, right? If they don't like this, they can go right back next year. So I'm curious if maybe they will go to 70 games, or I'm curious to see how they'll approach this. Or maybe I'd love the MVP fix, honestly. I'd be fine with that. You got to play 65 games win MVP. I'm cool with that, because I don't think the MVP is a very important award, in all honesty. I mean, I just think it's, in the NBA especially, I feel like their MVP voting is just insane. So it's not an award that I pay too much credence to anyway, but I really like what you said there.
Yeah, and I think you made a lot of good follow-up points to it. And what I would kind of end on is just, I think the NBA has done such a good job, and you and I have been so complimentary of them, of really being a modern and players league. And so I would expect the NBA to respond well to some of the criticisms, because I don't think the intention was bad, right? I know the NBA was just trying to encourage players to play, kind of discourage some of that excessive load management to an extent that we had seen over the last couple of years. And, the NBA, at the end of the day, they're trying to make the best product possible, right? And I think this hurts the product. And I like to think that the NBA has enough smart people to realize that, and hopefully go and reverse some of those things. So with that, then that'll close out our A block for this NBA pod. We'll be back in just one moment with our B block, talking about the NBA trade deadline.
Welcome back into the B-Sides of Sports. And now, as we go into our second block, another big thing, always around the time of All-Star break, is the trade deadline. One of my favorite times of the year in any sport. I think the NBA deadline usually, now last year's wasn't fantastic, but in years past, the NBA trade deadline has given us some very memorable moments. So I really like the way, there's just so much mobility in the league. It makes things entertaining. So as we look at some of the trades that have already happened, we've had some pretty big ones in season, in all honesty, in my opinion. I think Rozier to the Heat being most recent, that's a huge one, because obviously the Heat are a contender, but they've kind of been struggling. And so maybe getting a point guard, Rozier essentially might step in and do what Lowry was doing when they were in the finals. So I think that was a great trade for them. Siakam to the Pacers, obviously. Siakam's one of the best transition players in the league, and he's playing now with the best transition point guard in the league. I mean, that just seems like a match made in heaven. Pistons, obviously, they got Gallinari, and more importantly, got rid of Isaiah Livers. And then my Raptors traded Anunoby for RJ Barrett and Emmanuel Quickley. So Wilson, just going over the trades that have happened, what's kind of like your, I don't know, either give me your bigger picture on what you think these trades are kind of showing you, or what trades did you like in particular?
Yeah, I agree with you. First, I think the trade deadline is one of the most fun times of the year for any sport, particularly with the NBA. And what I've really liked about this year is we've had a lot of kind of deadline leading up to the deadline trades, right? And you mentioned all of them right there, but just a couple of the good moves that have stood out to me. I think Knicks acquiring Anunoby, he is just such a fit for what they do, right? Just the tough grit and grind, defensive style of basketball, and I think it kind of cleaned up some of the pecking order, taking out Barrett and Quickly, right? I think Brunson and Randall have really just, the Knicks are rolling right now. I think it's 8 wins in a row, and I know Randall's been injured for some of it, but the offense just looks like it clicks a little bit better than it was, and the defense is still as stout as it was. So I think it's a good move for the Knicks in a year, and we can talk about some of the parity later on, but in a year where there's not really a clear-cut favorite. Obviously, Boston looks dominant as ever, and Milwaukee should be one of the title favorites, but I think the Knicks are as primed as ever to make a run in the postseason here, so we'll see how that kind of evolves. And I agree with you completely on the Pacers. I think Siakam's in one of those just don't mess it up situations, and obviously one of the major talking points for him being willing to go there is because there's going to be some consideration to re-signing him to a further contract. I think for Indiana, when you're just a market that you're not going to attract a lot of outside of the market free agents, I think you've got to swing big when you can acquire a player the caliber of Siakam. And I think what they're really just betting on is Tyrese to be a true, number one, the guy that can lead you to a championship. And Siakam, while I think there are better number two options around the league, I don't think he's the worst. So I really like that move for Indiana. And finally, I think the Heat struggling has been a little bit of a surprise to me. And one thing that was kind of running across my mind a little bit is I wonder if Heat culture, the reverse of it, right, is kind of this burnout factor, right? Because we know, and it's so well documented, that those players are bought in every single day, every single workout, every single game, honestly. Ironically, they don't have the best regular seasons, right? And I think in part of it is just because of the culture they've built and just, the stress that their bodies are put under and kind of that workhorse mentality. I think it can kind of wear them down. And I think it's in part why they haven't been able to get through a full postseason run, right? Obviously, the year against the Lakers, we saw that Jimmy Butler was just gassed. I wonder if we're seeing a little bit of kind of that struggle in season, as well as just there's been conversation around moving some pieces on that roster. Jimmy Butler has been a name that has come up to an extent. And for a team that's been as good as Miami has been, right? They've been basically as good as anyone in the Eastern Conference over the last 5 years. The truth is they haven't gotten over the hump. And, for a franchise that has accomplished as much as it has over the last 2 decades, I think that makes them anxious. And I'm curious to see if there's another move on the horizon for Miami coming here in the next couple of days.
No, I definitely think that's interesting. I think the thing with Miami and with the NBA, I always bring this up when I'm talking to people, especially it's one of the main ways I defend James Harden when I'm talking about his all-time greatness. But if you're a good player in the NBA, realistically, you're going to be in the playoffs every single season, which is an insane thing to think about because everyone has down years. But in the NBA, let's say you're a great player. Most great players play at least 10 years. So that is an additional 30 games every year. It's what feels like 30 extra games. Obviously, it's not. In all reality, it's 15 or so, right? But still, that is extending your season. So about every 5 or 6 seasons, you've played an extra season than all of the other players in your league. And I think it's why we don't talk about LeBron's longevity enough, in my opinion, because what he's been able to do is so insane. But going back to that, I think the Heat might just be a little gassed because this is something where it's like you said, Jimmy Butler has looked pretty exhausted in the last few playoff runs. And I think that's just because when you're the star player on your team, I think it's natural that you're going to need other people to step up in the playoffs because, and that's almost what I expect, right? It's why I think Steph Curry, it took him so long to win MVP because he'd had those durability issues. So then those deep runs into the playoffs, he was struggling due to durability. And I don't even think that's a knock on Steph Curry. I think it's ridiculous how much flack some of these guys get for that. I mean, especially, a guy like Luka right now is one that sticks out to me. He's playing almost 38 minutes a game. If they make the playoffs and he falters and people give him crap, the dude is playing 10 minutes short of every minute in the game in the most, and again, one of the most high octane eras we've ever seen in basketball, in the shot clock era. So in terms of how many possessions per game and et cetera. So it's just crazy to me. And so I think the Heat almost just need a bad year, get bounced early to reset them. Because you're right. I think the mentality might just be a little exhausting. And maybe they do need a year to just get right and, get back to what they do best, which is winning with, these ensemble rosters.
And not by their own choice, but the Warriors had that in the 2020 season, right? Where Klay Thompson obviously was injured. KD was no longer part of that Warriors team. And Steph had a couple of weird injuries in that year before COVID happened. Excuse me. And I think, that really served to help them out, right? Kind of giving just a full reset of, you're right, doing 4 or 5 consecutive postseasons is an extra season. And we know how taxing just one season is. Doing 6 in the time period that other teams are just doing 5, in terms of the volume of games that you're playing, it's just an incredible feat. And I think there is kind of a reset factor that does need to happen there. So kind of moving forward, then some of the players that are still on the market, it's interesting because the Raptors were kind of that team that everyone has been calling for to blow it up over the last couple of years. And they finally did it to an extent, right? They're really committing to the Scotty Barnes rebuilds. And I think we're seeing the emergence of a lot of other of these teams now that the Raptors are off the market. And Chicago has a lot of players that other teams want to poach. The Hawks are underachieving to an extent, and DeJounte Murray's been a hot name. And then you look at teams in the West and the Warriors and the Lakers, where just given what the Warriors and Lakers have done historically, the standard for them is always to win and to compete for a title. And I think the way that both of those rosters are kind of positioned right now, they don't look like title contending rosters. And I think naturally with that conversation around trading some of those players, or, kind of resetting and doing a hard 1 year reflection, those conversations kind of flare up around this time of the year. Who do you think is truly on the market, and what are some potential trades you could see coming?
So I think the Bulls are, in my opinion, the team that is going to be the sellers. Having both Zach LaVine and DeMar DeRozan, those are two guys who, in my opinion, could go to a team and contend. Same with Jeremy Grant on Portland. I just don't think he makes sense. And honestly, his contract isn't too terrible considering how the NBA salary cap is going. I think he's on a 5-year, $160 million, if I have it right in my notes, which is, again, not too bad for a 27 player who plays very good defense and solid offense, So those are kind of guys I'm watching. And my big one, the one I feel like we aren't talking about, and I could kind of see being a splash move, to me, is Karl Anthony Towns. After that 60-point game, to me, that really just showed me how much this isn't his team anymore. And I think he's struggling with that. And that 60-point game to me reflects that, because it shows that he still has that number one upside. But again, with Karl Anthony Towns, he's just kind of a strange individual from what we've seen. There's obviously the weird thing with him changing the intonation of his voice, as well as, him acting tougher on the court. And then he's, just kind of more happy-go-lucky off the court. So just kind of a strange dude. But, trading for Gobert, and they struggled for so long figuring out. And again, the argument is, well, they got rid of all their picks to win now. So what sense does it make to trade out Karl Anthony Towns? Well, you have a great young core, and in a league where we see young players contribute so much quicker than ever with, getting European guys, or now these G League players, there's just so many more layers to winning while young. I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years here, a team wins that's very young, like a team similar to like what the Pacers are this year. I think we're going to see more teams like the Pacers, these young teams that are actual contenders, just because of how much more developed certain players are in certain categories. So Karl Anthony Towns, honestly, is one I want to watch. And then the two aforementioned players being the Bulls stars and Jeremy Grant are kind of the 4 I'm watching.
Yeah, I think those are all, excuse me, I think those are all really good options to kind of consider. And the Towns one I hadn't thought about, but I think it does make sense. And I think the pushback would be they're the number one team in the West right now. Why would they change anything? But I think the Timberwolves kind of would have to acknowledge that they aren't the heavy favorites to come out of the West, right? The parity, we've talked about parity with the NBA the last couple of years at large, but I think the parity is at an all-time high. And I think in a playoff series, I don't know if they'd be favored against a Denver or a Clippers team, or even a team like the Suns or the Mavericks. I think just a combination of the youth and some of the maturity factors of the team overall. I think Cat is the root of some of that. And I think a shakeup, when you're that close, we see it in this kind of Moneyball era of all sports, right? Teams push in all the chips and they go all in. So I would be really, really curious to see what the Timberwolves are able to acquire in exchange for giving away Karl Anthony Towns. In terms of some people or some names and teams that are on my radar, quietly the one that I really like, and I'll kind of bounce off what we're talking about with the Heat a little bit, is Jimmy Butler going back to the Sixers. And I saw this proposed trade earlier today, but if the Sixers sent over a combination of Tobias Harris to match the salary, a couple of first round picks, maybe some second round picks, a couple of swaps, as well as just anyone basically on the fringe of the rotation or that's in the rotation right now from a depth standpoint that Miami likes, whether that's Marcus Morris Sr., it could be KJ Martin, it could be even like a guy like Rocco, right? Just some of these, 3-and-D guys that would just help round out that Miami rotation right now. I'd be curious to see if Miami would pull the trigger on that. And I think the pushback to this one would be Jimmy Butler's kind of encompassed everything about Heat culture the last couple of years. But the truth is, what we've seen is it hasn't been enough, right? Over the last 5 years, even though they've gotten to the finals twice, both of their finals losses haven't been particularly close, right? It is apparent that even though they can come out of the East, they're kind of a step behind whoever comes out of the West. And with that, I think, Miami is a franchise that isn't okay with just making it to the conference finals, right? They are trying to win the title every single year. So I'd be really curious to see if they would be willing to kind of pull the trigger on that, and kind of do a hard reset year like we're talking about. I think and again, I'm saying pushback a lot here, but I think the counter would be if that puts the Sixers in a position where I think they become the favorite. If it's Butler, Embiid, and Maxey, and I wonder if Miami isn't willing to kind of deal to a separate contender in the East, even though Miami not view themselves as a true contender this year.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting. And again, Jimmy Butler's at a very weird career path. I mean, his whole life is pretty insane. His life story is very, he's overcome so much. So, it would be nice to see him win one. And I do just kind of think, as I said with the Heat, they have rewritten their culture so many times in the recent history, and they've done a great job at reinventing themselves. They went from Wade and Shaq to Wade, LeBron, and Bosh to just Wade to then, no Wade, then to Jimmy Butler, and all the time they contended. What they do so well is they find someone they're going to build around, and again, it's not always homegrown. Jimmy Butler was the guy they brought in, LeBron and Bosh they brought in, Shaq they brought in, but D Wade was the only one homegrown, and even then, he's one of the greatest shooting guards of all time. So naturally, you're going to build around him. So I honestly, I don't know if the Heat would trade him because he really is their life force, but I am curious to see that because, I mean, I could see him being a really good fit for the Sixers, not to mention his style of play is very complimentary, being a great two-way player. The starting lineup of Maxey, Jimmy Butler and Joel Embiid would be a great two-way lineup that I think is just very interesting in terms of the defensive versatility you could have, as well as Jimmy Butler not having to, harbor so much of the scoring load. I think would help him play even more elite defense, back to like his Bulls days.
Absolutely. So then the last thing I would mention here about the trade deadline is while I don't have any particular specific trades in mind, I think one thing that makes this year's deadline super, super interesting is that conversation around so many teams believing that they can make it in to the postseason. And I think there's kind of a feel of, in a year like this, just get in and see what happens in a 7-game series, right? With the play-in, all of a sudden, I think you have basically 12 or 13 teams in each of these conferences that really believe they can make it into the postseason, right? There's kind of this idea of just get to the 10 seed, fight your way into the postseason, and then just see who your matchup is, right? And because of that, I think a lot of these teams are going to be willing to make a move that they think will put them over the top. So I think on the flip side of that, you go to look at some of these bottom feeder teams to see what are the pieces of these rosters that aren't very talented that will help both teams, right? For the Pistons, right? Who can they take away that'll help their tank even better? And who's a player that other teams will view as valuable enough, and what are they willing to trade? So, I think some of the names that come to mind, Bojan Bogdanovic for the Pistons and someone like Dorian Finney-Smith for the Nets, I think the question becomes, what's the asking price, right? Or, Dorian Finney-Smith, his name's been thrown around a lot for 2 first-round picks. Do I think he's worth 2 first-round picks? No way. I think that's absurd. But I think it all comes down to what the market is set at. And I think last year, the Gobert trade really oversaturated the market, right? Gobert went for 4 first-round picks and half of the Utah roster, right? The Minnesota roster, right? And then on the flip side, KD's asking price was incredibly high as a result of that. This year, I think, Siakam went for something a little bit lower. Obviously, no superstar players getting exchanged back, although the Raptors did have to give up a couple of picks, or Pacers, excuse me. I'm curious to kind of see what the market trade value is set at.
Yeah, but the Raptors also have an idiot GM, so I think when you take that into consideration, man, it's crazy how Nick Nurse goes to a different team and immediately has success, and then the only thing that's stayed the same with the Raptors is the idiot GM that everyone wants to praise for some reason. But
I mean, people think
regardless of that,
Ujiri's the hottest thing on the market.
I know we just cut Christian Okoklo, dude. That was a pick he was raving and ranting and raving about for months, and then the dude averaged like a block a game and like 2 rebounds for a year, and then he's off the roster. I can't. Not the topic. We're not talking about that right now, but I do agree with the sort of the opinion. I love the playing game. I know you're a fan of it too. I just love playoff expansion. It's just so fun because as much as people love to write it off, I just think it gives the first round of the NBA playoffs. Let's just be honest. Most of the matchups are usually pretty boring. So at least we're getting good playoff basketball before a boring first round. So I'm all in favor of it. I love it. So I am curious to see, if now being a few years into it, do we see the culture change behind the trade deadline where 11 seeds are getting aggressive? Usually they're the ones selling, but now they might be in position to try to make small moves to just push themselves into consideration. So.
And I think I would go one step even further. I think it's already happening. The Warriors currently sit as the 12th seed, and the Warriors have, it sounds like they're going to be incredibly active. Mm-hmm. Curious to see if they're able to actually move, say, that CP contract. Wiggins has played a little bit better as of late, and it sounds like Kuminga's untouchable, so kind of a tricky line to balance there. But, I think that's really interesting to consider because, the Warriors, just given kind of their pedigree, and they've been there before, they've got to feel like if they can just get in, they'll have a shot, right? They did it last year against the Kings. And so, we're going to see, I think we are going to see that a lot of teams that are very much on the outside of the playoff picture think that they can get in with a move, and we'll see what kind of shakes up as a result of that. So with that, that'll close out our B block here, talking about the deadline, and we'll come back right here in a minute to kind of talk about the recent explosion of scoring and offense around the league, kind of an ongoing narrative for this NBA season. Welcome back into the C block of this NBA episode of the podcast. And to close out today's show, Drake and I wanted to talk about kind of the conversation around the scoring around the league right now, just how inflated it's been to extent. Obviously, the tempo at which games are being played at is one of the fastest, if not the fastest in league history. And with that, we've seen a surplus of 60 and 70-point performances over the last couple of days. We obviously saw Embiid's 70-point performance the same night as Cat's 62-point performance. It was also the point of the infamous Kobe Bryant 81-point performance. So that was kind of a cool NBA historical moment. And then over the recent days, we saw Booker have a 60-plus point performance, as well as Luka going for 73. And so, with all of these crazy inflated numbers, I think, there's a conversation on whether or not that's actually achieving what the NBA wants and improving its product. And, I personally think to an extent it hurts the league because I think the way that these numbers are being achieved is a little inauthentic to an extent. But Drake, I think, historically you've been well documented. You love scoring, you love ISO scoring. So I'm really curious to kind of hear your perspective on this.
Yeah. So for me, I absolutely love it because at this point in the NBA, there's not much you're really rooting for besides your team to win, right? There's just not many storylines. One of the best storylines year in and year out is high scoring games. I'm a stat guy. It's what keeps me entertained throughout the year. I am way more likely to turn on an NBA. Again, I always talk about how I think Adam Silver's like the best commissioner in sports and like they just get it. When I get that notification on ESPN or TNT, hey, Karl-Anthony Towns has 44 points, I'm going to turn that game on out of principle just because of that. I don't even remember who the Timberwolves were playing. I'm just going to be honest, because to me, that game was not about the Timberwolves anymore. It was about me watching Karl-Anthony Towns shoot the ball 78 times in bad shots consistently just because he wanted to. Or like with Luka, I got the same thing. I got that notification after the second quarter. I turned that game on. I was watching the Embiid one, but I just kind of got lucky with that one. But the Donovan Mitchell one is one that jumps out. My favorite high-scoring game of all time, and I think one of the best games ever, is James Harden's Madison Square Garden 60-point triple-double. That is still, to me, one of the coolest games ever. And again, it's because of the grandeur of that. And also, I think what it shows, Wilt Chamberlain's 100-point game was fake. Now, we'll get into that at some point. I've got things lined up for that, so we won't go too much into that today. But so to me, I don't really count Wilt's record. So I love seeing scores, especially like Luka was 73. That's awesome to me. I think that means we're one step closer to beating Kobe's 80, which I just think will be a great day for basketball because it'll be a great moment for us to reflect on Kobe as well as, pay homage to the modern generation. Now, will it turn into that? No, people will just complain that the defense is soft, the league doesn't care, yada, 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 whatever. But again, Do people forget why the league got like this? Because defensive basketball wasn't fun to watch and people stopped watching. So, again, have we overcorrected? Absolutely. Do I love the scoring performances? Absolutely. The NBA is probably going to change. I have a feeling something will change, but I mean, I love this. This is my favorite type of basketball. I don't care if it's, I always tell Wilson, I was like, if I was an NBA coach and I had a guy like Steph Curry or James Harden, I would have him shoot the ball 70 times a game, every single game, because if he's my best player, I want the ball in his hands every single play. It's like that old Reddit post where someone posed the idea of just putting the 4 other players on the floor around Steph Curry to make a barrier and let him shoot threes. I'd be trying that because scoring, to me, these numbers, these insane performances are so fun to look back on. Donovan Mitchell's 70-point almost triple-double. I just watched the highlights from that game a few days ago. Like that's awesome for me. And I get that it isn't for other people, but for me, this is great. It doesn't help the NBA at all. It probably hurts them, but for me, it helps me. So I love it. I mean, that's really all there is to it.
Yeah, and I'd meet you kind of at like an 80-20 percentage mark, where 80% I agree with you, and 20% I think there is too much of an overcorrection happening right now. But my thing is, I think the correction to the overcorrection will happen naturally. I don't think this high-flying offense is really that sustainable, to be honest. One of my favorite games that's happened this year so far, probably the favorite game that I've seen this year, was that Warriors-Lakers game that went into double OT. And that was an incredibly high-scoring, high-flying offense game, particularly because it happened in crunch time. And I think that's the distinction that becomes important to me. I don't think these 153 to 120 games are exciting to watch, because at one point, when the team is down 20, it does feel like it just turns into a track meet where they're just running up and down the court, bombing threes, and there's no progress being made either way in the game. But on the flip side of it, we get some incredible performances, and this is a whole separate conversation, but for Steph and LeBron to still be carrying the league when there's 20 potential superstars around the league is just a testament to A, how great Steph and LeBron is, and B, to an extent, an indictment around the rest of the league. Like, what are you guys doing? How are Steph and LeBron still the 2 most popular guys in the league when their combined age is 75? But I digress there. I think the offensive explosion is entertaining to the point where it doesn't start to make the game, it starts to look not basketball, right? And I just go back to the track meets are really what becomes not interesting for me to watch, right? And I haven't played basketball at like a super high level, but I have played basketball before, and me personally, high scoring games were fun, but games where it was just layups and transition threes were not. And I think that's the line that the NBA kind of has to toe. They have to find a way to keep the game balanced enough that defense can still have an impact on the game while still letting the offense be the entertaining aspect. Because you're right, if the overcorrection happens too far, no one wants to watch just guys running up and down the court and shooting threes, right? That's the All-Star game, and we know how poorly the All-Star game does. So,
well, yeah, and I mean, just look at literally every sport wants more offense almost always, because you're right, it does sell. Again, for me, like the best example of this is the steroid era in baseball in the 2010s and early 2000s, where they were like, oh, well, no one tested positive for steroids, because they weren't really checking. They had the best numbers they'd had in 20 years. Of course they were going to let it happen, right? So, but then they won't put him in the Hall of Fame. So to me, that's just what I feel like the NBA is going to get from this era. I'm scared that in 10 years, we're going to look back at all these games and be like, oh, well, that was in this era. That was before the 3-point widening rule, right? So those don't count. Those are inflated stats. So that's more of what I hope doesn't happen. I just hope we don't discredit these in a few years if we do kind of naturally correct. I hope we just appreciate these for what they are and then keep going from there.
Yeah, I hope that doesn't happen too. And, historically, we have done that to the NBA, right?
Mm-hmm.
We do kind of discredit some of those video game numbers from Wilt and Oscar because the game was played at such a high tempo. And I think, as, history continues to go on and as things start to balance out and even out to an extent, I hope people realize, A, it was the 3-point era. So, we know how important that is to the game. I don't think we can just discredit that entire part of the game. And I also think playoff scoring, and I'd have to check all the numbers on this and go in depth, but playoff scoring has not been as ridiculous as the regular season has been. And I think that's an important kind of point to keep in mind as we head closer to the postseason. There are, even though it feels like all of these games are just barn burners, there are still a number of games. I think just the other day, I think it was the Pelicans and the Knicks, or maybe it was the Thunder. It was a combination of those teams. And score was something like 107 to 83. And it's like, there are still these low scoring games, right? It's not every night that every game is just up and down 140 to 139. So I think the league, again, Commissioner Adam Silver's done an incredible job. I think the league will do well to kind of adjust and recognize it. And I don't really have too big of a problem with it, honestly, because I do think kind of the natural correction will happen. And I think postseason basketball is still some of the best basketball we've seen over the last couple of decades. So I can't complain.
Well, and we've also, again, we've talked about an expansion team for the last 6 years. We get an expansion draft, that'll definitely shake things up. I think that in its own right, I think could limit the scoring. Famously, after the Wilt Chamberlain 50 point a game season, I think it was a year or 2 years after they expanded the league. And then again, numbers across the board went down. You know, there's that crazy MVP photo where I think it was, was it Worthy who was averaging like 36? Bill Russell was averaging a 2020 triple double. Wilt was averaging 50. Oscar was Oscar. So it's like, you know, you get numbers like that and then you expand the league a little bit, stretches out the talent a little bit, and then it kind of overcorrects. So I think that could help if you want an easy fix for the league. Also, not to mention, I just think it's only a matter of time before Vegas gets a team in every sport. I mean, we have a hockey team now.
Yes.
We have an NFL team. I wouldn't be surprised if we get an MLB team here soon. So I think NBA is soon to follow. And I've also heard after the bubble, the NBA was tossing around the idea of having a casino with a stadium built into it, which also would be a hotel. So it'd sort of be this triple threat thing. So definitely wouldn't be surprised by that as a potential way the league would make a ton of money and then also, you know, be able to help with the maybe insane scoring numbers a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a good solution. And bonus take for anyone that's listening or watching all the way to the end here. You know, if we do go to an expansion league, how many teams do you think don't get a single player taken off of their roster in an expansion draft? You know how, like, with the expansion, they always talk about, like, you would get to protect, say, somewhere around your top 5 or top 6 players.
I think it's 6, right?
6?
I think that's the rule.
I mean, I think a team like the Pistons or the Wizards, do you have to protect anybody?
Cade and, like, the Wizards protect, I don't know. Yeah, no
Jordan
one.
Poole,
Yeah,
maybe.
I mean, yeah,
Kyle
maybe.
Kuzma's on the border.
Yeah, that's crazy. No, I did. Yeah, I mean, well, and that's definitely the thing. Like, I just would love to see an expansion draft in any sport. It's such an interesting concept.
It's such an interesting concept.
We haven't seen one in one of the, I guess, hockey and baseball both have recently, or no, I think just hockey, actually, not baseball. I don't know what I was thinking. The A's are relocating. I think that's what I was thinking of. But, you know, when they got the Knights and the Seattle Kraken. So, you know, we've seen only one of the big four expand in the last, I think, 20 years or 25 years almost. I think it's been since an expansion team. So, I mean, I would love to see a little bit of a shakeup in any of the sports leagues, honestly. But I think NBA's, probably the best candidate, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think we're all here for it.
And with that, this episode will come to close. We hope you enjoyed. Get ready for more content like this as the NFL season comes to a close. We'll probably have one more in-season NFL podcast, and then we'll have some draft coverage. But NBA is about to be the main thing on the docket again. So please be ready for that and look forward to that. Also, if you enjoyed the video and made it this far, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps us tremendously, as well as check out our TikTok account. Listen to us on Spotify, or if you want to see any of the other season 3 podcasts, check the playlist, all of which that I named are down in the description below. But we hope you had a great time listening. Thank you for watching, and we will see you guys next time. Later.